Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're having a wonderful afternoon. We're excited to have you here for our strategic leadership panel. We just want to quickly introduce some of our presenters today. My name is Michael McGurl. I'm the admissions coordinator, so I'll be helping kind of moderate this panel this afternoon. Also joining us is Professor Ed Barrows, who is our academic director for our Masters in Organizational Leadership program. Also joining us on our panel, Professor Richard Morales, who is part of our School of Engineering, and former General George Casey is our visiting distinguished senior lecturer. So thank you all for coming this afternoon. We're excited to hear what you have to share with us. I'm going to pass it over to Ed, and he's going to get us started.
Mike, thanks very much. Let me add to Mike's introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here at our online panel entitled Strategic Leadership Insights from the U.S. Army, featuring Brown Professor of the Practice Rich Morales and Brown Visiting Distinguished Senior Lecturer George Casey. I'm your host and moderator, Ed Barrows. As Mike mentioned, Professor of the Practice of Leadership and Academic Director of our new Master of Organizational Leadership program here at Brown School of Professional Studies. So as we kick off our inaugural class or cohort of the Master of Organizational Leadership, I wanted to take some time to really share with you some thinking on the topic of strategic leadership, and no better way to kick things off than with two people who are truly experts in the field. Now, while this webinar will be focused for obvious reasons on the military aspect of strategic leadership, we will be having other webinars that focus on areas outside of the military, in particular in the private sector and the public sector and nonprofit setting as well. But we have experts here, so we want to take advantage of that. These seem like a great set of folks to start with because they have decades of command experience. And what we want to do today, what I've asked them to do, is really spend some time talking about how the Army leads through complexity, the fog of war, builds resilient teams, and drives ultimately mission success. And that's something that's really applicable. We'll call it across the spectrum, whether it be in the public sector, the private sector, or elsewhere. So what they'll do today is really talk through all of the aspects that strategic leadership entails, from the topic itself onto how we do leader development in the area that they've been so steeped in. Following the panel, we'll have a Q&A discussion. So if people are interested in asking questions of these top leaders, please feel free to send in your questions. But let me do a proper introduction beyond what Mike did. So with us today is George Casey Jr., as Mike mentioned, visiting distinguished senior lecturer here at Brown, retired four-star general, and former chief of staff of the U.S. Army. He goes by George Casey Jr. because his father, George Casey Sr., a West Point graduate, was a major general in the U.S. Army, having served in both Korea and Vietnam and commanded the storied 1st Cavalry Division. George attended Boston College High School, Georgetown University, and then Denver University, where he received a master's degree in international relations. He's held command and staff positions literally at every level of the Army. His most recent last assignment was as commanding general multinational force in Iraq from 2004 to 2007. And the 36th Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army from April 2007 to April of 2011. Currently, he serves on several boards, does leader development. He's in Montana today, calling in from there and actually doing that. Does coaching with top talent, and has recently finished his 3rd book, Leading in a VUCA World, which will be released over the next few months. Joining him is Rich Morales, Professor of the Practice of Engineering at Brown University and retired Brigadier General, U.S. Army. He is a native of San Antonio, Texas. He attended West Point, receiving a Bachelor of Science in Aerospace Engineering, and has an MBA from the Yale School of Management and a PhD from the University of Cambridge in Systems Engineering. He is trained as an armor officer, and over his 30-year Army career served in 5 different armed conflicts, ranging from the Balkans to Baghdad. In his staff assignments, he served as the aide to the head of NASA, a White House fellow in the Obama administration, and was also on the faculty of West Point. He's also the recipient of the Purple Heart Medal awarded for injuries he sustained during Operation Iraqi Freedom. Together, these two gentlemen have over 70 years of combined experience in defense of our nation. So personally, and on behalf of Brown University, I want to thank you both for your decades of dedicated service. So our first question, I'm going to direct it to Rich, and it's on the topic of strategic leadership. So definitions aside, Rich, when you think about strategic leadership from your perspective, what is it? And how is it different from what you would see or someone would experience wherever they work in their early to mid-career?
Great. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? I just want to make sure.
Ian.
Yeah. First of all, it's great to be in a panel with you all, and it's a little awkward when the chief is on here with you, right? So it's like you're performing with Yo-Yo Ma, and you're like the leader of your little high school band. But I'll take on the question you asked, which is what is strategic leadership. It's also sometimes easy to say what it isn't, right? Because we throw strategic on everything,
Right.
and to me, it's a process, right? And I think that strategic leadership is very future focused, very forward focused. If you run a spectrum of things you do day to day, even I suspect, and I watched him in action, even General Casey, as he's running the Army, definitionally, most everything he does is strategic because it has implications on policy, on culture, on process. And I would say somewhere there's a well-intended young tank platoon leader, tank company commander, non-commissioned officer. They are absolutely doing strategic things in that they're shaping culture that helps build on the strategy. But most of what they're doing is probably tactical. So you've got this spectrum that ranges from tactical to this thing that connects it all, operational to strategic. General Casey's going to talk about vision, right, and how that's super important. But to answer your question, I think that understanding where you need to be and what type of leadership you need to apply. So I think strategic leadership is often tied to a position, but it's also a mindset. I think it's how do you shape, as I said, policy and process that brings all these things together that I think requires, which would be, I think, most value. And again, these are all just perspectives, one chipmunk's view, but it requires a deep understanding of what your role in the school play is, right? Mm-hmm. You could be, and we had them, right? I commanded a combined armed task force of about 1,000 people right across a third of Baghdad in what I would say is a culminating experience. It didn't come at a more senior rank. It was the job that I could point to when I had been in much less time than I ended up serving that brought everything together. And while I was doing tactical stuff, I think the implications that I was doing was strategic. But my point I was going to make is every once in a while you'd get these really well-intentioned, probably West Point grads to poke an eye at my own institution or somewhere else. And I say this tongue in cheek, that were ambassador lieutenants, right? They'd figured it all out. They're really read up on foreign affairs. They know exactly what, General Petraeus or General Casey, what they're doing wrong. If we just do these things, the war will be done by Thursday, right? Very well-intentioned, and we want well-read, smart folks. But, there's a difference between knowing that your day-to-day job has to be the tactical execution of the task at hand. And I'll close by saying this, at least in this probably overlong description, is anything we do that is leader related has a task and purpose. And I think the more junior you are, you're very task oriented. These are the 5 things I have to be done today and the 12 big things I have to be done by the end of the week. It doesn't mean you're not strategic. It doesn't mean you're not smart. And I wasn't picking on the ambassador lieutenants, right? Those people end up becoming great, well-rounded general officers. But I think knowing where and when to apply that, the flip side, and I think of value to people listening, is the strategy and the strategic leadership is knowing that your purpose is very important. The tasks, you've got other folks that are going to figure those out. But if you give a clear purpose, and I'm armed with 2 things, task and purpose, the purpose is far more important because then I understand what I'm supposed to be doing. I'm not limited to the specific task. So I think in that, mindset, that's how the Army approaches it. As somebody who teaches, and we'll talk a little bit about that, this sector blend, right? I think that you want to foster a culture of creativity, a culture of defining left and right boundaries, what it is you do and don't do. And then last, you want to be a catalyst for forward action. I think strategic leadership is about articulating a future vision that's very forward thinking, marshaling the resources, marshaling the people, and then concretely figuring out how to get there. And if I sound like a professor who talks too much, it's because I am.
Yeah, well, we can't blame you for that. So I'm going to throw it over to George. I'm going to throw it to George to jump on that, but let me just make sure I kind of summarize some things. So, no offense, but most people on this call are probably not aspiring to be general officers, probably vice presidents, senior vice presidents, CEOs of their own company, if not larger organizations. I like what you said about task and purpose. And I think when we think about purpose, oftentimes that comes back in the civilian sector to this kind of start with why concept. Like, why are we doing this? Knowledge workers want want to know why. So I think you're astute in saying that people sometimes get buried in the task. But with that, let me throw it over to George to add his perspective on this and this idea of strategic leadership, and then maybe jump into vision. Do you see the world the same way as General Morales here, or what are some of the things you see? Especially, I think one thing that I hear people say is, and senior leaders that I work with, we all work with, ask this question: how can I get my mid-career managers to be more strategic?
Yeah, it's interesting. I used to tell my generals, I said, as a general, you're not just responsible for running your own organization, you're responsible for helping me run the army. And that takes a mind shift. Um, I- in the Army, we think about, and this will build on some of the themes that Rich talked about. In the Army, we look at leadership at three different levels: the direct, the organizational, and the strategic. Um, and the major shift that you go through moving from the direct, which is the first line supervisor, to strategic, is you go from getting things done to envisioning and communicating a different future to prepare the organization for future success, and then inspiring and influencing others to get there. It's a different set of skills. And I always tell the MBA classes that if you want to be a successful leader at any level, you have to commit to learning and growing at every new level of leadership. Um, Two last things. What I found is the higher I got in the organization, the more the keys to my success lay outside my organization rather than inside. So I had to spend progressively more and more of my time focusing on what was going on outside my organization that could impact it, and less time supervising the very capable people that I had working for me. And I would tell you that the biggest uh, thing that I don't see happening is people not making that transition, going from directing everybody to doing the really hard things like developing and communicating the vision and strategy. So to the point that as the commander in Iraq and as the army chief, I probably spent 60% of my time outside the multinational force in the army, influencing people outside of my direct control, and only about 40% of the time inside.
I like what you're saying. I'm going to put my sort of mid-career professional hat on and just challenge you. And Rich, you can jump in here too. I hear what you're saying, but George, I'm so busy day to day. I've got so many things I've got to do. I mean, my team is down. I'm looking at my to-do list. It's doubled. How am I going to spend? I mean, I think that's the real question. How am I going to figure out how to do this outside in thing you're talking about to come up with a vision when I've got a laundry list of things and I'm not even good at delegating on top of that. So how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I just say I grew into this. Okay, Lieutenant Casey wasn't very visionary. I was 99.9% inside, and it really wasn't until um, colonel level command. So now I'm in my early 40s,
Hmm.
where I started seeing the shift. And in the Army, everyone told me up to that point, look inside, stay inside your own organization, make it as good as you can. Now, that's when I started realizing that would only get me so far, that the keys to my control increasingly lay outside. So this is something you grow into. Uh, Rich, go ahead.
What did you do? And then Rich, I'll pass it back over to you. What did you do to grow into that? What kind of things did you do? I mean, was it reading? Was it site visits? Was it education?
The Army has a great program of leader development. I mean, every one of its officers and non-commissioned officers attends 4 different levels of leadership training over the course of their careers. And these are not just weekend seminars. These are 6 to 9 month programs. So the Army helps. But the other thing that we just started doing after I became the chief was getting people out of their comfort zone and pushing them into what we call broadening experiences,
Mm.
to get outside of the day-to-day hassles of the Army and look at what's going on around you. And I will tell you, I took advantage of 2 3-year opportunities to do that. One as a younger officer in my 30s, and one as a more senior officer in my early 40s. And it made a huge difference. Rich?
Sometimes in organizations, those broadening experiences our participants can find, whether that's on a large project like an IT implementation, or it's setting up another site or developing a product. In some cases, we don't advocate anything specifically, but I've seen people leave an organization with the expectation they might come back, and the Army's great about that. And Rich, over you spent time at NASA, you spent time in the White House. You had a variety of these broadening experiences that General Casey's talking about. So, what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, so I absolutely think that by the time you need to have those skills, if you wait, it's too late. So the fact that I am trained in systems engineering, and the Army spent a lot of money trying to make me a systems engineer. Either I'm a product of, we need to school Rich a lot because we started with like this inferior product, but the Army paid for a Ivy League MBA, and I emphasize Ivy League not because it's any better or worse, but it was a awesome program where I sat next to people that were completely different. Somebody that came from Walmart that worked at Walmart or Goldman Sachs and covered Walmart. Laszlo Bock, a good friend of mine who, is head of people operations at Google for a decade and was one of the original people hired. All of these folks become people that are part of your portfolio, not in a transactional, I got to build this little network of people that's going to move me forward. They're just interesting, and they're solving really, really tough problems, and I'm stuck. I probably don't need to hear from somebody that sounds an awful lot like how I sound, because we were trained the same places, think the same way. So you pick up the phone and you call, person X or person Y. I think that's the sort of developmental value. The return of equity on the Army, I think, is huge. I think it gets you used to being in these very fluid, uncomfortable environments. I do think there's a risk, right? You have to, I got great advice. One of my bosses at NASA, or my boss at NASA, had been Secretary of the Navy when he was 35, and he's terrific. Sean O'Keefe to this day is a person, but that's a different system and process, right? You could get politically anointed to head the Navy, and he got brought in to clean up some tailhook stuff and to really change the culture of the Navy. Very specific task and purpose. And he forever changed this idea that I had to, you have to be certain this tall to ride the ride. I mean, he was having strategic impact as a 35-year-old. I shouldn't be afraid to at least learn from him, which of course I was there to do. So I really think that this exposure to groups outside, and in the Army, I love the Army, right? But we can necessarily become very myopic. I mentioned before this call, I spent 14 months in Baghdad living out of a abandoned nuclear power plant, right? Those aren't ideal conditions to know anybody other than the 1,000 or so people that you're interacting with. But even there, to expand on what General Casey said, right? I saw the boss a lot. He was down there in the weeds, not making sure I knew what I was doing. I wasn't always doing what I was doing, but he was making sure he understood what the situation on the ground was. Whereas I was out having chai with people that may or may not be trying to hurt us, right? Or developing or figuring out how I fit in the big strategic picture. So I think that's the power. Your question was very, very practical and really good, right? Like, all this stuff is interesting. These two are just sharing war stories about, things that aren't relevant to me. The power of strategic leadership is you understand where you fit in that. And unless your goal is to never advance beyond day-to-day whack-a-mole, you're eventually going to be asked to lead. And to lead, you have to have some direction you're leading people in.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. It's interesting. I'm going to go back over to George and ask him a question. So I think we put in your bio that you presided and led a transformation of the U.S. Army. So you need to have a vision for that. I think that's one of the things I tell my students is whatever level you're at, have a vision, have a point of view on the future. But there's a practical question. How do you do that? How do you come up with a vision?
Yeah. Well, I will tell you, it does not happen on command. When I came back from Iraq, I had 60 days, from a little less, from the time I left Iraq to the time I was sworn in as the Army chief. And I thought in that 60 days, I would be able to frame my vision for my 4-year tenure. And I put together a transition team of smart folks to help me think my way through it. And I divided the team in half. I said, all right, you guys, I want you looking inside the Army. And I want you telling me what's going on inside there. And you guys, the other group, I said, you look outside the Army because I want you looking at what people who think and write about the Army are saying what we should be doing. And then I said, I want you to help me write my vision statement. I mean, I thought 60 days was more than enough time to do that. So a couple of days before I took over, they all came in and said, okay, General, we got your vision. You ready? I said, yeah, whip it on me. You ready? America's Army, an agile, disciplined warrior team, dominant across the spectrum of 21st century combat.
I love it.
Rawr. I mean, doesn't that sound like something that you see on a poster in a waiting room? And I knew immediately two things. I knew it didn't answer my number one question, which is what are we really trying to accomplish here? The number one responsibility of a leader is to point the way ahead. And it begins with answering that question. What are we really trying to accomplish? And the second thing I knew immediately was I didn't own it. And I had to own it if I was going to drive it into an organization of 1 million people spread all over the world. So what I realized was that I didn't have a deep enough understanding of what was going on in the Army to have conviction that I was pointing the Army in the right direction. So my wife and I embarked on what turned out to be about a 4-month listening tour. And we went all over the Army. And my goal was to touch every aspect of the Army and hear from people. And when I do that, I'd come back and I'd share with my key subordinates, my key staff, the insights I was getting. And they'd help me, they'd tell me their views. And I believe the human mind, especially when you're dealing with big things like vision, works iteratively. You don't just get it on command.
Right.
Your thinking gets sharper and sharper and sharper. And so while I'm traveling, I'm also doing a lot of reading, and I'm also talking to people outside the Army who can influence us. And over time, I start seeing, I'm hearing people say the Army's broken, the Army's hollow, the Army's not ready. And that wasn't the case. It was a very seasoned professional force. But there was no question we weren't where we needed to be. We were sending soldiers to combat for 12 to 15 months, bringing them home for a year and sending them right back. It was absolutely unsustainable. And so I had to communicate to the soldiers and their families that the leadership understood that we weren't where we needed to be. But I also had to communicate to the Department of Defense and Congress that we still needed their help. And so as I was interacting with my folks, I started thinking of the Army's position as the scales of justice. We were so weighed down by the current demands of Iraq and Afghanistan that we couldn't do the things we knew we needed to do to take care of our soldiers and families, meet the demands of Iraq and Afghanistan, and prepare for the future. And so I said, put the Army back in balance. And that, as I tried that out on my folks, we tweaked a little bit, but that became my vision for my 4-year tenure. But it took 6 months. It took 6 months for me to get the clarity of thought that I could articulate that and then drive it into the Army. I'll tell you, in my view, that drove a significant plan across the Army as only we can plan, that left us in a far different and better position 4 years later.
Yeah, thank you for that. People may not remember, but I do, how challenging those tours were for soldiers. 12 to 15 months in country was just grueling, and more importantly, their families, to have, their sons, daughters, fathers, mothers away for that kind of time, just the experience of that, very, very, very challenging. So, I mean, you really led at a pivotal point in the Army's future. It's interesting. You've talked a lot about inside and outside, back and forth, this iterative, and it sort of goes and underscores how long it takes to really think through and the number of data points that you need to pull together. And I love another thing you said for this 4-month listening tour. I think any good leader knows that he or she needs to listen and really try to understand what's happening inside and outside the organization. For people on the call, there's a great book by Michael Watkins called The First 90 Days. You probably both have heard of it. If you're going to take over any organization or ready yourself for leadership, it's great to look through because it's got a bit of a checklist and some of the things you need to kind of kick in terms of the tires, et cetera. So thanks for that. Rich, well, back over to you. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about values and character. I think most people on the call have probably heard of duty, honor, country, those kinds of that really frame up what it means to be a graduate of West Point, to serve in the Army, to serve the nation. It's not about that per se, but this notion of values and character. How important is that in leadership? I mean, we're at a very interesting time in our nation's history. We've got a lot of things happening with the administration. We have global conflict. We've got all kinds of interesting relations with foreign policy, not to mention drastic and dramatic technology changes here at home. You see things like the Catholic Church even weighing in on what should Catholics be doing with AI, just as an illustration of a lot of different types of groups asking questions. What do value and character play role-wise in terms of being a good or effective leader?
I think that perspective provides clarity. It gives you clarity of what your purpose is and maybe the azimuth and direction that you're going. It's not prescriptive, but it just says these are the things I won't do. These are the things that are outside of not just my own personal values, and these get conflated a lot. I certainly have views that, I have all kinds of opinions, right? And, one of the things I loved about serving in uniform is I was apolitical, certainly publicly apolitical. I was in the White House on, my class at the White House Fellow. We started on September 6, 2001. And we were all together as a White House Fellow class when all that chaos happened. And we worked for President Bush. And I did that for 18 months. That's party one. Years later, I was President Obama's, as one of his policy aides. I ran I was an executive director of a team that supported veterans as they transitioned out. And I think there is power in saying that, what I supported and was behind is the office of the presidency, right? I have strong personal views and I like both presidents, but I'm using that as an example of the limiting, if you don't know as an organization what you stand for, and we want an apolitical military as an example, that's different than my values. But I think they overlap. Is there's just basic things about treating people with respect. Whatever those things are, whatever the values of the Army, and we have them. They're explicit. They're stated. And at some point, I wrote an article, because I dabble at this nerd academic stuff. But it was a quick piece at the Yale School of Management called "Integrity as a Value Proposition." Right? How does is it just we're all ethical? Yeah, people are all generally honest. Yeah, you can point to the bell curve, but the reason it's powerful is because it becomes a way that you operate. Not only that, it becomes the way your people operate. That's not what we do in the Army, and sometimes you got to get coached into that. We come from different backgrounds, different perspectives. Like, oh, hey, that thing you just did. Yeah, that seemed a lot like get ahead stuff. Like, we're all watching you. That will give you 1 or 2 more mulligans, but then you don't belong in at least my unit, and you certainly probably don't belong in the Army. And I think that ability to decide who we are and who we aren't is pretty important. And relating back to what General Casey said, right? There's a strong connection between what you espouse your values to, both personal and professional, and authenticity. And it's tied through with trust. If General Casey was giving you the spiel about like, yeah, this is what we did, we're on a listening tour, guess what? He came to Baumholder, and Sheila came to Baumholder, right? Spouse to spouse, right? Not general to never think that I'm, general, but just saying, I'm here, I'm listening. And I think your words have to match your actions. And in the Army, it'd be easy to critique, sure, but we do. Like, whether or not you agree with every decision they make. By the way, I have learned that all my leaders become a lot smarter once I'm sitting in their shoes. I'm like, oh, this crap's a lot harder than it looked on TV. So I know that I'm not being super explicit on values, but I do think it's very, very powerful to define whether it be performance norms, right? We don't have these behaviors. We don't tolerate drinking and driving. Why? And then we give them the why, right? Because it kills other people, because it's not who the Army is, right? Which is different than saying we hold ourselves up to be perfect. We're far from perfect, right? One of the things I loved about being in the Army is, these wonderful subset of Americans I had, they had a way of like, doing things that ended up in the paper. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. How did this happen? Well, they're young and they do young things. So I don't know if that hit on the power of the values of it, but I think it gives us alignment, it gives us purpose, and it allows us as an army to credibly say, and the extreme case is the law of land warfare, right? I commanded a third of Baghdad, ran around with some great people doing heroic things. There's things we're not going to do just to get a win that day. The army operates a certain way. So, sir, I feel like I'm your warm-up act. General Casey, you can hear, comes in with like the
I was just going
level
to keep
answer.
building on what you were saying. And
Go ahead.
leaders with strong values build strong organizations, period. And when I do this with the MBAs, I say, think about the men and women who've led you up to this point, and think about how you felt about the ones who you thought had strong character. And then think about the ones that you maybe thought didn't have such strong character. And that leaders of with strong character engender trust. And that trust enhances their moral authority that it takes to lead today. Rich might remember this, but one of my predecessors at the Army Chief of Staff was a guy named Creighton Abrams. And he used to say, the higher up the flagpole you go, the more your butt hangs out. And what he meant by that was, if you're not living the values that you espouse as you climb the corporate ladder, the only one that doesn't see it is you, because everybody's watching you. And they see that you can't be trusted.
Interesting advice. It's interesting. I served a little while in the Marine Corps, and we used to have a saying, you can fool your bosses most of the time, you can fool your peers some of the times, but you can't fool the people that you lead any of the time. And I found that to be true. Not that you'd want to fool anybody. But both of you talked about values, purpose. In my research, as I'm writing one of our first classes in the master's degree program on ethical leadership, what we find is, what you're saying sounds like a little bit of a homily, leaders set the tone, et cetera. But the research does show that ethical leaders build ethical followers and ethical organizations. So it's not something you can really decouple from the people that you lead or the work that you do. So now another thing that I found was very interesting when I got out of the military, people would say to me, boy, it must have been very easy as an officer in the military because you just tell people what to do and they do it. And I always got a kick out of that because I said, well, you may not know exactly how people are, but just because you wear something on your collar and you're quote unquote in charge, that doesn't mean people do it. So how do you think about influence and communication? I mean, as the Army Chief of Staff, I would imagine you just send out an email and everybody would do it.
Yeah. The Army, after 18 years at war, in 2019, published its second leadership manual since September 11, 2001. And it said that leadership is the activity of influencing people by providing purpose, direction, and motivation. Mm-hmm. And people, I run into what you said all the time. I mean, people think that the general will come to work and say, let's all wear our hats sideways today. And people say, yes, General, and they really do it. People need to internalize your intent. And one of I believe people in an organization fall across a continuum. I call it the compliance, consensus, commitment continuum. At the compliance level, they're collecting a paycheck. They're going to do no more, no less than they have to do to get through the day or the week without getting yelled at and pick up a paycheck. Obviously, that's not where you want them. Consensus is they're listening. They understand what it is you want what you're trying to do, but they might not see exactly where they fit and how what they're doing contributes to the success of the larger organization. So they're hesitant. They're hesitant to exercise initiative on your behalf. And then there's commitment, where they understand what it is you're trying to do. They see how what they're doing contributes to the larger whole, and they're out every day exercising initiative on your behalf. Well, people don't get there by reading a memo. We have a technique in the Army that Rich will be familiar with called briefbacks. Mm. And I'll give you a quick example how I use this in Baghdad. So we prepared our campaign plan in about 30 days, which is what I was given by the president to get it done. And he approved it. So then I called in my 2 3-star commanders and my staff, briefed them on the plan. And they asked questions and we answered the questions. And I said, okay, now you have a week to develop your plan. And then I'm going to come down and you are going to brief me back on how you're going to do what I told you to do. Well, a week later, I go down and guess what? We weren't as clear as we thought we were. They misunderstood some things and they'd had a week to think about it. So we hashed it out. And when I left that time, they had a much better view that they were inside my head and they were ready to go out and exercise initiative. Then, because it was so important, I said, okay, now you have a week to brief your 2-star commanders, and I'm going to go down and have them brief me back on how they're going to do what I told you to do. And I did. Well, remember the telephone game we played in kindergarten?
Yeah.
Every time you go down a different level, it gets garbled. So we did the same thing. And there were 7 of them. And this took a lot of my time, but it was well worth the effort and the synchronization of thinking that it produced. And then because it was so critical that the people who were actually going to execute it, the colonels, the 17 colonels, I went down and to each of them and had them brief me back. And the same thing happened. But again, the synchronization and the understanding it produced was empowering for them to go out and exercise initiative on my behalf. And then because people were rotating in and out all the time, I went around to every unit within 30 days after they got there and had them do the same thing. So
Wow.
that
I love that. I love the compliance consensus commitment. That's a great way. Let me ask you a question. As you were going down in the briefbacks, did you ever change your mind or adapt to anything?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. Because you go down and everybody has a different view. And it was, for example, different parts of Iraq were at different stages of progression.
Mm.
And when I go down to the south where the Brits were, and things were fairly peaceful. And I could see where the northern part of the country could be in months to years. So it helped me see things. And the view from the top is always no more than the view from the top. It may not be reality. In fact, it isn't necessarily reality. It's your view. And so I found that if I was really going to get clarity in my mind, that I had to absorb a whole different spectrum of views.
You were in Iraq too, Rich. Is what General Casey's saying make any sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And I think this is the power of strategic leadership, right? I never had to guess what I was supposed to do. I might fall a little short. I led where people were actively trying to kill us a lot of days, right? And it helped. And by the way, these briefs that General Casey talked about, they'd be in a conference room somewhere in some abandoned nuclear power plant, but they'd also be out in the ground, right? We just chuckled about the last time or one of the times I saw him in theater, right? So I think that that connectivity is super important. And I do think that a lot of what you're hearing now is the power of what you personally bring. Now, you got to be yourself, right? This works because General Casey was willing to figure out that, like, maybe I don't have all the answers. I want you all to help me. But at some point, he became the chief and said, no, I heard all your feedback. This is what we're doing, because he's taking input from the National Command Authority. He's taking inputs. So again, I made a tongue-in-cheek joke about, like, hey, my bosses got smarter the longer I served, right? The context matters. It's very clear what you're expected to do. And none of us are magicians, right? You can't anticipate changing forces in warring factions. You can't anticipate, how long an appetite the country has for being at war and the drawdowns and these things. And, the various layers of generals, like the commanding generals I worked for, were all very, very different in personality, different in approach, different in communication. But somewhere they were getting knitted together by the boss and at a higher level somewhere else. And I think that is, for me, what's super important. And I'm looking at some of the questions that people say, well, how do you balance all of this, grandiose, pretty sort of vision with, like, on the ground, people still aren't doing the right things, right? Junior non-commissioned officers in private industry. How do you influence those people? I think it's very important for them to see you out doing things. So if you aspire to be a senior leader, maybe you don't, right? Maybe you're just very happy doing what you're doing. So this is not saying follow these and you'll pin on stars, which, you know, your viewers won't be pinning on stars. But I think you can have the most impact when what you're doing is super clear, when you feel like your voice is being heard. And yeah, I spent 1,187 days in Iraq, so I'm very familiar with the place. And the tours that General Casey talked about, you have to balance it out. And just to go back to something you said, the Army sent me from, you know, one of the ground tactical commanders, along with Brian Eifler, sir, who's our new G1, to get a PhD in the UK. And I did not feel like that put my career, if that, you know, if we're looking at that, at risk at all. The Army undermined that risk, said, hey, dude, you've been shot at plenty and clipped a couple of times. We're going to send you here. And we think that going to teach at West Point, while it's different than commanding at, you know, multi-echelon, is super important. We're going to show you how important it is. We're going to pay for a 3-year PhD where you're going to get a PhD in engineering, right? So I think that your words have to match your actions. And I always felt like the Army invested in my personal and professional development. And right about the time where I was wondering, you know, how I could continue redeploying again, the Army said, we're going to take you off that treadmill. And they have to do it for you because our natural instinct is not to take yourself off that treadmill. And I do have a concluding thought. And as a consequence now, because I didn't know how this story ends, right? I'm the leader in residence of the U.S. Coast Guard Academy, where we do leadership for a living. And I spend time down there, you know, and I'm their time now. They're kind enough to, and I love that they first lead themselves and then teach cadets to lead others. And I think I do that for free, right? Because to me, that is my jam. I really like sharing my hard-earned stubbed lessons and then helping a big organization. I'm not down there espousing any, you know, miraculous wisdom, but I really can get behind their values, their organizations, and, you know, saving people's lives, which is what the Coast Guard does.
Yeah, thanks for that. You know, it's interesting to hear both of you talk about this idea of, you know, taking time to sort of soak and internalize what people are saying at different levels. I think there's an old concept for most of the people on this call, probably never heard of it, leadership by walking around. And I think in the environment that we live in, where I can spend my days in my office behind my screen and IMing people, it's not so easy anymore to get out and wander around and see what's going on. But I think that's important, right? Because that's when you stumble across things and you say, what's happening over here? Well, oh, the North and the South are different. Interesting. Some of those things I think are good lessons even today, if we're not, you know, blindsided by, or blinded rather, by too much technology. You know, it's important for people to get out and get in different parts of the organization and outside of the organization to see what's going on. So thanks for that. But this assumes that we can learn and adapt, right? This assumes that we have the capacity to learn and adapt. I think the Army has sort of spearheaded the after action review, which some people may have known. And if folks do want to put some stuff in the chat, by all means, feel free. I'm not sure we can get anybody into the service academies on this call, but we'll see what we can come up with for some insights. But how does the Army learn? We'll start with you, General Casey. What are the things that either institutionally or individually you did as a leader to make sure that this large, sophisticated, complex organization is learning and adapting to the environment?
Yeah. You know, when we were attacked on September 11th, the country was attacked on September 11th. We were thrust, we, the military, were thrust into a fundamentally new environment. Where for 30 years of a 40-year career, I had spent training to fight other armies, and particularly the Soviet Union on the plains of Europe. And I spent the last 10 years of that 40-year career learning to fight a different kind of war while I was fighting it. And that is something, I mean, if you think COVID, but the leaders in the lead were thrust into this fundamentally new situation, and you had to figure it out on the fly. And you had to figure it out together. Because we all, at the time, we all had book knowledge of counterinsurgency, but none of us had ever done it. And so we had to learn as we were going. And we have this thing called the combat training centers, where they basically try to mirror the environment that you're going to go into. So we would bring trainers from that training center to Iraq, and they'd ride around with us so they could take the right lessons back. And then we were always learning. We no sooner got the campaign plan out than I launched a study of all of the counterinsurgencies in the 20th century to try to draw lessons from those. And we took those and we sent them out across the force. A year into it, I was getting a sense that we're not implementing counterinsurgency doctrine effectively. So I sent a team out that spent 6 weeks going all around the command, bringing back lessons. And we went to school on that and published a different one. And then I realized one of the recommendations of that group was we need a counterinsurgency academy in Iraq to train people coming into Iraq on the idiosyncrasies of operations there. And so we did. So we were constantly learning and adapting as we went through, and we had to be very purposeful about it. And so that's something, especially today, that strategic leaders at every level have to be continually pushing the envelope so that people are learning from what's going on and seeing new opportunities.
Yeah.
What do you think, Rich?
If I could chime in, yeah. I also teach here at Brown. And I love that I have the flexibility to do both, and it's just one class a term. But what I love about being here is when I'm teaching, I'm learning, right? There's nothing more fun than being in a classroom, and some of them are online, and that isn't quite the same. But I absolutely think that what drives me, what I enjoy doing most, is learning. I think about the leaders that I admire most, and I know we're going to be close on time. Sean O'Keefe, this amazing human that ran NASA, was my boss at the White House. Later on, ran a big defense aerospace company, was chancellor at LSU. Never stopped being a wonderful human. Came to visit in the UK when my kiddo was born. I asked him, like, well, what brings you here? He's like, you. That's a top. That's just top-notch human, right? That I would follow that guy anywhere. Mike Beach, who was my boss in Baghdad, right? So what was special about him? He was a smart SAMS guy. SAMS is our special ninja school he was a tactical expert that thought strategically, and it showed every day. And he's courageous. He fought in Panama. I listed, Julia Coxon, who replaced me in the Department of System Engineering, right? Where I thought we were, and I know we are, developing cadets that can think better, that can outsmart a future adversary, that are not, I joked about the ambassador lieutenant, but they're not shy about wanting to be smart, right? And you got to hide it a little, right? Because, our soldiers don't want to necessarily hear you solve some quadratic equation, but our problems are hard to imagine. So we better get people that are comfortable with not knowing all the answers, that are going to take people's input and are going to solve problems. And the last thing I'm learning, what draws me most to systems engineering, which is I talk about here, is how do you structure, as a strategic leader, or maybe you're a mid-grade leader, how do you structure the environment where you're going to produce results? Because if your environment's off, if you don't have the right alignment, you're not going to succeed. And as an example, I did this awesome program where they brought Olympic athletes and senior Army people together at Tuck at Dartmouth. And it was fascinating because I thought I had nothing in common with this Olympic medalist, right? Well, I still have nothing in common with this awesome human. But it turns out there's a lot of things similar to how you prepare for in extremis leadership and how you prepare for a sporting event. And hats off, my last, it sounds like a plug, Conley Early, and this would be some advice. He started last night for the Red Sox. He was one of our students at West Point, left the academy, which made me sad, but he knew who he was. He went to the University of Virginia, ended up playing in the College World Series. And despite all of us saying, dude, this is a huge mistake. Like, you should stay here at West Point. This is good. Hang in there. He knew inside as a kid that he probably is going to be a Red Sox because he was that good, and you have to believe in yourself. So you should take everybody's advice. But at the end of the day, you got to go be Conley Early, right? And by the way, it's like best start in franchise history. And I love that kid. Quasi plug for Conley Early. But the point is, none of this works if you're not happy doing what you're doing. I love being down at the Coast Guard Academy. I have this bipolar world where I come up here also. And I would say that you could hear the passion in General Casey. He hasn't been the chief for a while, and he still talks about the Army like he was running it yesterday.
Well, thanks for that. So we are running up against time, and I would encourage folks, if you have a question, there's one in the chat, feel free to put it in. This is a speed round. So last question to each of you, and I think you sort of spilled into it both. General Casey, we'll start with you, and then actually we'll stay with you, Rich, and then we'll go to General Casey. How do you develop leadership skills? How do you develop as a leader? I mean, if I'm on this call, how do I develop myself? The Army's great about giving you opportunities. Both of you have had education outside the Army. The Army puts you through schools. The military does in general at every level of your career. But I'm not in the Army. How can I develop myself as a leader? Rich, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I'll be quick. You practice, practice, practice. You know you're going to fail. You get up, you get better, you learn from failure. General Casey mentioned the Officer Action Review. Take yourself seriously when it matters, but don't take yourself so seriously that you can't get better, that you're afraid to go try something. I operate out of my comfort zone a lot. Unless you have a colossal ego and think you're everything to everyone. And then last is, I think, leadership. You don't always make the easy calls. You don't always make the popular calls, right? It's easy to be liked if you're just giving everybody what they want. You know, all of your leaders expect you to make the tough calls on the ground. And that means that, you know, maybe some friendships get strained, right? Your friends will understand you're making the best call for the organization. You're making the right thing. And by the way, you're not perfect. Maybe that was the wrong call, but today my name's on the sign and that's what I'm going to do. And you do it with, I think, humility. That would be my advice. Strategic or tactical or whatever is you just can't be somebody you're not, and you can't have all the answers. So I'm glad you're on this webinar for those of you listening, because that means you care about getting better, or somebody made you be on this call.
Thanks, Rick. This ties to the first question that's in the chat, General Casey. We're talking about developing leaders. Someone said, as senior leaders, what do you find the most effective way to ensure junior leaders are building those skills around task and purpose? How do you think about, you know, you've trained generals and presumably leaders at all levels in your career. How do you do that?
What I found, it varies over time. I taught, it was so important to me, I taught leader development at every level of command. At the lieutenant colonel level, I had about 1,000 soldiers, and my target was about 30 lieutenants. And they were in their early 20s. A lot of energy, not a lot of knowledge. What they needed was to be technically and tactically competent so that they had the confidence to lead. So I structured the program around that. Taught it every Friday. At the next level, the colonel level of command, my target was about 30 captains. These are more senior folks. They've been in the Army about 8 to 10 years. They're in their late 20s, early 30s. So I did it once a month. This, I was focused on tactical competence, giving them the opportunity to learn and how to maneuver their larger organizations. At the 2-star level, my target was lieutenant colonels. Now, these are people in their late 30s, early 40s who are set in their ways, but they still needed to grow. And so I did it once a quarter. And then as the Army Chief of Staff, my staff calculated I spent 15% of my time teaching generals from as soon as they came out on the list to be promoted to general. I had a seminar that was titled Introduction to Strategic Leadership, with it all the new promotable colonels came with their spouses. At the 2-star level, I sent them to business school. I sent them to business school at University of North Carolina because we needed people to have some type of insight into how to run a big business. At the 3-star level, at the senior 2 and 3-star level, I sent them out for training with industry, so they'd see how other big companies dealt with leading change. And then lastly, as people move from 3 to 4 stars, I had a personally structured program where I sent them out to leadership at the Peak in Colorado, and then I had a session with them to make sure that they were up to speed on their new responsibilities. So it's something that I just feel it is so important. It's your opportunity as a leader to give back, because nobody gets to the top of an organization without people helping them along the way. And the higher I got, the more I felt responsible in giving back to others.
You know, I love how both the Army and you personally, both of you, are committed to leader development at every level. I think that's one thing, certainly in the School of Professional Studies and at Brown, we're committed to developing leaders is one way to do it. But I think the message is you need to, at every level of your career, be developing yourself, you know, early, technically and tactically proficient. As you grow and get more senior, building those kind of experiences and, you know, knowledge of leadership that you can take. So that's wonderful. Let me turn it over a few questions in our last couple minutes. one of the things that I see here in the chat is, and this is usually comes up, how does strategic leadership handle dysfunctional behaviors and unforeseen chaos after implementation, with kind of a sort of common sense, coherent view and a flexible view? Why don't we start with you, George, and then we'll transition to Rich. And if other people have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat too. How do you manage dysfunctional types of behaviors really at any level?
Well, first of all, you expect it. And we live in a world where instability is the norm.
Yeah.
And frankly, it's stability that's the passing phase. And you have to condition yourself to accept that. And it goes, in my view, it goes against human nature because we like stability. We like
We do.
corners to be square. And they're not, and they're not going to be. And so you have to be able to deal with it. And I believe everyone today talks about resilience, right? They want to be able to deal with dysfunction and chaos and be resilient. Resilience has to be built in advance, both personal and organizational resilience. And I found that I periodically I would have to sit down with my folks, not every day or week, but maybe every 6 months maybe, and sit down and say, okay, what are the things, what's the dysfunction that's liable to come at us? And how will we deal with that? And just the fact that we considered it, we were better prepared to deal with it when it happened. Rich, over to you.
Yeah, I think the two things that you do as a leader is you're competent and you're not a pro at everything. So people should see the things that you're still working on. And then the one that should come naturally, and if you can't, maybe this is not your line of work, is you should care, right? Like as a minimum, because somebody's paying you. So go do that thing you said you were going to, go be the person you said you were going to be at your job interview, do that. And I think the way you blend the two is if you explain to folks like, hey, whatever this behavior, whatever you think this is that is okay, it's not okay, because it's not just impacting you, it's impacting the organization. Whether it be organizational trust, whether it be behaviors that are going to end up in the paper, right? And it's not fear of some media reaction in the social media world, right? It's just not what we do. You go somewhere else, and if that's fine, then go do it there. And then the caring part is it's super, super quick. I don't know that there's a lot of anxiety around being in high pressure, high performing teams. It's not just the military, right? It's everywhere. It's my banker buddies. It's my folks that are doing startups. It's students here that are anxious to like go change the world in positive ways at Coast Guard, wherever it is. So that stress, in our case, it's brought on by people, in a combat environment, but it happens everywhere. And I think you build these amazing people that are your teams, right? If I had a takeaway, it's like, A, be yourself, B, be competent, B, care. But you're going to get for no extra value, wherever you are, that you're working really, really hard, is all these people that are working hard with you become your lifetime friends. Those are the people you call, right? I rattled off a couple of them. In whatever we've experienced, Christy and I, in our 16 moves and 30 plus years, and General Casey's got me beat, I'm sure, where we weren't signed up for all those, but we went, and my wife always felt personally supported. I always felt personally supported. And when all the crazy things happened to you in life, the people I leaned on were my friends in the Army, not, from school X, school Y, school Z, the Army, this big, big family. And if you could foster a culture where people feel like they're heard and they're part of a family and they're being well led, not perfectly led. I'm far from perfect leader. So I think that's it. And I think that gets you to strategic leadership, because you're not just all making it up. It's not a pickup basketball game. You're going in the right direction.
Good. One last question. We got a minute left, and I'll turn it over. So we'll send it to you, George. As you get more senior in an organization, you find there's a lot of yes people. They just agree with the boss. They don't know how do you disagree if you think the boss is not right, but you don't want to say, boss, I think you're full of baloney.
Yep. And that is alive and well, and for sure. The higher you go, the less people are likely to come in and tell you what they really think. So I found that I had to open the door. I'd have to ask the leading question. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I sat in big meetings in the Pentagon, and there was an elephant in the room, and nobody, even 2- and 3-star generals, wouldn't ask the big question, and I'd have to make sure that it got answered. And so one, open the door, ask the leading question. And I guess Well, I guess I might just leave it at that because I lost my thought, and I'll turn it over to Rich.
Well, I think you've had more than enough contribution both. So as we hit noon, I got to turn it back over to Mike. But I want to just say thank you so much, General Casey and General Morales, for your insights, and for George and Rich for your friendship. It's wonderful to work with you. For those folks on the call, I'm putting my email in the chat. I'll forward it to these esteemed gentlemen if we didn't answer your question. But Mike, back to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Ed, and thank you to our panel. Really enlightening discussions today. As we wrap up today, I did just want to share, if any of this conversation interested you today, if this is something you thought really sparked some interest, our online Masters in Management and our online Masters in Organizational Leadership programs is where you're going to find much more of these discussions if you choose to apply to these programs. Being sensitive to time, I do just want to share some important dates. We do have a spring application currently open, the priority deadline being September 15th, and our final deadline October 15th, and the semester starts January 21st. And our fall application will open October 15th, and you can see the other important dates down there. So we'd love to have you join our programs. If these conversations really sparked your interest and you want more, this is definitely the avenue to find that. And then lastly, some just important information. You can email us if you had questions to onlineMastersAdmissions@brown.edu, and you can apply today at online-masters.brown.edu/apply. And we'll be sending this presentation out to you all as well. So again, I want to thank all of our panelists today for this enlightening discussion. Thank all of the folks who attended today. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day. And we hope to see you joining our program here at Brown in the future.
Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Great job, guys.
It was fun.
Yeah,
Sir, it's always good to hear you chat.
he left. Talk to you
Hey,
later.
buddy.
Bye.